Laura Bennett had never planned to return to the small town where she had once spent her summers as a child, but after the end of her marriage and the long, exhausting years of city life, she felt pulled back towards something quieter and more permanent, something she could shape with her own hands and claim as entirely hers. When she saw the advertisement for the weathered Victorian house on Sycamore Street, she felt the kind of resonance that bypasses reason, a certainty that this broken building with its sagging porch, peeling shutters, and cracked windowsills was not simply a piece of real estate, but an opportunity to rebuild not just a home, but a self that had been left scattered in the wreckage of compromises. The house had stood for more than a century, and while time had pressed its mark on every corner of the structure, the bones were sound, the high ceilings and ornate woodwork promising a hidden beauty that only patience and stubborn dedication could reveal again. Laura, who had trained as an architect but had spent most of her career designing sterile office complexes and uninspired apartment blocks for demanding clients, recognized at once that this house could be her true project, the one that would test not only her skills but her endurance, a private commission from fate itself. For months, she dedicated every free hour to the renovation, balancing her day job with late nights of sanding floorboards, repainting walls, and sketching detailed plans for how the rooms would be restored to their original proportions. She spent weekends at flea markets searching for authentic fixtures, carrying home heavy brass doorknobs, stained glass panes, and antique light fittings that spoke of another era. The neighbors watched her progress with a mix of curiosity and distant respect. In a community where most people hired contractors and settled for modern replacements, Laura was seen sweating on ladders, hair tied back, hands covered with paint, working alone until the sun dropped behind the trees. The effort gave her a sense of power she had not known for years, a deep rhythm of labor that cleared her mind from the echo of past arguments and the silence of an empty apartment. She was not just restoring a building. She was laying claim to the right to inhabit her own life again, to root herself in something solid and lasting. The rooms slowly transformed around her. The kitchen, once a dark and sagging space with warped cabinets, became a warm place with marble counters and restored oak cupboards that smelled faintly of lemon oil. The parlor, whose faded wallpaper had peeled away in strips, revealed plaster that she carefully repaired before painting it in muted green, a shade she had chosen from an old Victorian palette book she had found in an antique shop. At night, she would stand in the doorway and look at the room with a kind of reverence, seeing not just walls and floors but chapters of survival written into every brushstroke. Even the garden, which had been a tangle of weeds and rusted lawn ornaments, was slowly coaxed into order with flower beds and a small vegetable patch. For the first time in years, Laura felt herself breathe deeply and without tension, walking barefoot across her creaking wooden floors, feeling the house breathe with her as if it too were relieved to be seen and cared for again. She had neighbors, of course, though she did not seek them out. On her left lived the Harrisons, Alan and Ruth, who kept their lawn neatly trimmed and rarely spoke more than a curt greeting. On the right was a younger couple who seemed friendly enough but kept to themselves. Laura did not mind the distance. She was an introvert by habit and found comfort in the quiet space she had carved for herself. The town itself felt suspended in time, with its main street of brick buildings, the faded diner, the post office that still smelled of dust and ink. People remembered her family name, vaguely recalling that she had once been the daughter of the Bennetts who used to spend summers in the cottage by the lake. Their nods of recognition carried no weight of judgment, only a mild curiosity, which suited her well. By the end of spring, she finally felt she was arriving at a balance. The house stood solid and dignified again, the porch restored to its original symmetry, the windows cleaned so that the glass shone brightly against the afternoon sun. She often sat outside with a notebook, sketching details of railings and window frames, ideas for further improvements, letting the breeze carry away the fatigue of the day. It was in these moments, sipping tea and listening to the hum of distant traffic, that she told herself she had found the place where she could remain, a home both personal and professional, a structure that echoed her resilience. She believed the worst parts of her life had been dismantled along with the rotted beams she had replaced. What she could not know, sitting with her pencil scratching across the paper, was that her house, the very symbol of permanence and refuge, would soon be split open by a conflict as sharp and sudden as the strike of an axe, and that the people she barely acknowledged across the street would force themselves into the very core of her sanctuary, claiming that the walls she had labored to save were not hers to keep at all. The first sign that something was wrong came on an ordinary weekday evening, one of those mild spring nights when Laura Bennet drove home from her office with the windows of her car rolled halfway down, breathing in the soft scent of lilacs blooming along the quiet streets. She had been thinking of nothing more than dinner and perhaps another hour of sanding the balustrade on the upstairs landing, a task that both tired her hands and calmed her mind. But as she turned onto Sycamore Street and slowed in front of her house, she noticed an unusual commotion. A pickup truck stood half on the curb, its rear bed stacked with lumber, and in the waning daylight she saw two figures moving steadily across her lawn. For a moment she assumed the truck must belong to contractors hired by one of the neighbors, until her eyes followed the line of wooden posts already hammered into the ground. The posts cut a jagged path not across the Harrison yard next door, but directly through hers, running at a strange angle that led from the edge of the street straight into the side of her house, disappearing beneath the frame of her front porch. At first she laughed out loud, a sharp, incredulous sound that startled even her. The image seemed surreal, as if she had stumbled into a parody of suburban disputes, one of those absurd stories passed around at dinner parties. But the hammering continued, deliberate and unhurried, and when she stepped out of her car and let the door slam behind her, the Harrisons finally paused and looked up. Alan Harrison stood with a hammer in one hand, his plaid shirt darkened with sweat, while his wife, Ruth, held a bundle of thin wooden slats that she had been laying carefully between the posts. Both regarded her with a mixture of irritation and smug composure, the way people look when they believe themselves to be entirely in the right. "What exactly are you doing?" Laura demanded, her voice rising with disbelief rather than anger. "This is my house. You can't just drive a fence through my porch." Alan wiped his brow with the back of his hand and gestured with the hammer toward a large, yellowed sheet of paper that lay pinned under a brick on the lawn. "Not your porch, Laura," he said with calm certainty. "You've been living under a misconception. The boundary line runs right here. Always has. We're just putting the fence back where it belongs." Laura stepped closer, her shoes sinking into the soft ground where he had torn up her flower bed to sink a post. The paper was an old survey map, its edges frayed, the ink faded in places, but the thick black line had been traced recently in pen, running at a slant that cut directly through the footprint of her house. "This is insane," she said, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "That can't be official. I have the deed. I have the survey from when I bought the property last year. This house has stood on this lot for more than a century. You can't possibly think half of it belongs to you." Ruth gave a small laugh, a sound that sent a shiver of unease through Laura because it carried no hint of doubt. "You'll see soon enough," Ruth replied. "The town records were a mess for decades. Boundaries shifted. Things were overlooked. Our family has been on this land longer than anyone, and Alan finally found the documents to prove what we've always known. You've been using space that was never yours." Laura felt as if the ground beneath her had tilted, as if she were standing on a stage where the set had begun to collapse in slow motion. She thought of all the nights she had spent scraping paint, all the mornings she had woken to the creak of her own stairs, believing she was alone and safe inside something she could finally call hers. And now her neighbors, people with whom she had exchanged nothing more than polite nods, were driving stakes into that security, literally and figuratively, with the confidence of conquerors reclaiming lost territory. "I want you off my property now," she said, forcing her voice into steel, though her heart pounded furiously. Take your truck, take your map, and stop this before it gets worse. If you don't, I'll call the police." Alan's eyes narrowed, though his tone remained eerily even. "Go ahead. You'll find the police more sympathetic to a rightful property claim than to a woman trespassing on our land. The law is on our side, Laura. You should prepare yourself. This is only the beginning." She stood frozen as they gathered their things with no trace of hurry, Alan driving one more post into the ground before tossing the hammer into the back of the truck. Ruth folded the map with careful precision, as though it were a sacred relic, and tucked it into a large envelope. Then they climbed into the cab, the engine rumbling to life, and drove away, leaving behind a crooked line of wooden posts stabbing up from the soil, an unfinished fence that looked more like a scar carved into the skin of her yard. That night, Laura sat at her dining table surrounded by papers, pulling out her deed, the surveyor's certificate, the closing documents from when she purchased the house. Every page confirmed what she already knew. The property line stood exactly where the porch began. The house was entirely hers. There was no ambiguity. Yet, she could not shake the image of that brittle map with its skewed boundary slicing her home in half, and the calm certainty in the Harrisons' voices as if they were not bluffing but acting out a plan carefully rehearsed. Sleep evaded her. She paced the rooms she had worked so hard to restore, touching the walls as if to reassure herself that they still belonged to her. But in the silence of the night she imagined the posts outside leaning closer, multiplying, enclosing her like a cage. She thought of the words Alan had spoken. "This is only the beginning." And she understood with a chilling clarity that this was not a misunderstanding to be settled with a single phone call. It was a declaration of war, and the battlefield was her home. The next days became a blur of restless attempts to regain clarity. Yet every step Laura took seemed to drag her deeper into uncertainty, as though the air itself had thickened and each movement required more force than it should. She began with the obvious measure. She contacted the county office, explained the situation with as much composure as she could muster, and requested verification of her property boundaries. The clerk she spoke to was polite, perhaps even sympathetic, and promised that a field surveyor could be sent within a week to review the site. A week felt intolerably long, but she told herself it was a reasonable solution. That official confirmation would cut through whatever illusions the Harrisons had constructed around their brittle map. With this thought, she managed to sleep a little, though the hammering of her heart never really subsided. When the surveyor arrived, a middle-aged man with sun-leathered skin and a calm, deliberate manner, Laura felt a surge of hope. He measured carefully, checked the existing markers, studied the layout of the street with the patience of someone who had walked this ground countless times. His conclusion was simple and unsurprising. Her deed and survey were accurate, the boundaries aligned exactly where her documents indicated, and the Harrisons had no legitimate claim. For a fleeting moment she allowed herself to breathe in relief. But then, as if orchestrated to snuff out any sense of resolution, the Harrisons appeared at the edge of the lawn carrying that same envelope with their yellowed map and a second document Laura had never seen before. They thrust it toward the surveyor, insisting it was a notarized copy of a land adjustment agreement dating back decades, transferring a strip of property to their predecessors. The surveyor examined it with a frown and explained that if the document were genuine, it might complicate matters, since old agreements sometimes resurfaced even after boundaries seemed settled. He did not say the Harrisons were right, but neither did he dismiss them outright. His cautious neutrality, professional as it may have been, felt to Laura like betrayal. After he left, promising to forward everything to the county records office for verification, Alan Harrison lingered at the property line, his arms crossed, his gaze steady and cold. "You can fight this all you want," he said, his voice low enough that only Laura could hear. "But paper doesn't lie. We'll keep building. You'd be wise not to stand in our way." Ruth stood beside him with that small, knowing smile that seemed designed to unnerve rather than comfort. Then they retreated, leaving Laura trembling not from fear of violence but from the crushing realization that her home could be consumed by a bureaucratic fog in which truth and falsehood blurred until even officials could not distinguish them. The following week the posts multiplied. Every evening Laura returned from work to find another section of fence erected, cutting across her lawn, inching closer to the porch as if the Harrisons were staking their claim inch by inch, regardless of pending clarification. She called the police twice, but both times the officers who arrived insisted it was a civil matter, something for the courts to decide rather than for them to dismantle. They made notes, shrugged with regret, and left, their cruisers rolling away while the wooden skeleton of the fence continued to rise like a mocking monument to Laura's helplessness. She threw herself into gathering every shred of proof she could. She revisited the dusty shelves of the county archives, combed through boxes of handwritten records, photographed faded maps and correspondence. What she discovered astonished her. Mentions of boundary disputes between the Harrisons' grandparents and the then owner of her house, arguments that had dragged through hearings but were never finalized, leaving behind fragments of contradictory paperwork that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. One memorandum suggested the Harrisons' claim had once been dismissed for lack of payment on filing fees, while another, written years later, ambiguously referenced a pending transfer. She felt like she was chasing ghosts through corridors of ink and paper, trying to pin down a truth that kept dissolving under the weight of conflicting records. The stress seeped into every corner of her life. At work, she found herself distracted, staring at blueprints without comprehension, her mind replaying the image of the crooked fence posts outside her house. At night, she walked through her rooms as though guarding them, checking locks, pressing her hand to the cool glass of the windows while listening for footsteps. More than once, she thought she heard someone moving near the porch, only to rush outside and find nothing but the half-constructed fence looming in the moonlight. The very sight of it filled her with a strange nausea, as though it were not wood and nails but an infection spreading across her property. When a letter arrived from the city council informing her that a complaint had been filed against her for occupying a portion of neighboring property, she nearly tore it to pieces in fury. She recognized the Harrisons' hand immediately. They had not only intruded physically but had carried their war into official channels, forcing her to defend herself against accusations that inverted reality. The letter stated she must attend a hearing to present her evidence or risk a fine and potential injunction. It was then that she understood with chilling clarity that the Harrisons' strategy was not a sudden act of madness, but a campaign. Slow, deliberate, and relentless. They would bury her not just under fence posts, but under paperwork, complaints, and insinuations, until she was too exhausted to fight back. Yet beneath her fear rose something harder, a resolve she had not expected. She had rebuilt her house with her own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail, carrying heavy beams until her muscles ached and her skin blistered. She knew the value of persistence. If the Harrisons wanted war, they would find she was not as fragile as they believed. Still, as she stood at her window one late night, watching Ruth Harrison linger at the edge of the fence with a lantern in hand, tracing the line of posts with the tip of her finger as though sketching possession in the air, Laura felt an icy chill. This was no longer just a dispute over boundaries. It was a siege, and the enemy had already breached the gates of her sanctuary. By the time the council hearing was scheduled, Laura Bennett felt as though months rather than weeks had passed since the Harrisons had first driven their posts into her lawn, and every day between had been consumed with the exhausting rhythm of preparation, anticipation, and dread. She arrived at the municipal building on a gray morning with a folder so thick it strained the seams of her leather briefcase, filled with copies of her deed, the certified survey, old letters from the archives, and even photographs she had taken of the house across decades from local historical society collections that clearly showed the structure standing in the same place long before the Harrisons had inherited their property. She told herself this arsenal of evidence would cut through the haze, that once everything was laid before neutral eyes, the matter would be settled with finality. but she also knew that the Harrisons had not walked this far only to back down at the first show of logic. They would come armed too, and their confidence in their yellowed map suggested they believed their weapon sharper than hers. The hearing room itself felt designed to unnerve. It was not a courtroom, but a plain chamber with fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, a long table at the front where 3 council members sat, and rows of chairs where a few curious neighbors had gathered to watch. Laura sat on one side, her papers stacked in careful order, and across from her the Harrisons entered with slow, deliberate steps, Alan carrying the large envelope like a sacred text, and Ruth clutching a binder that seemed heavier than necessary, as though its weight was part of the performance. They nodded politely to the council but ignored Laura, their eyes never once meeting hers, and that refusal to acknowledge her presence felt more cutting than open hostility. When the proceedings began, Laura spoke first. Her voice trembled slightly at the outset, but gained steadiness as she unfolded her narrative. The purchase of the house, the official survey she had commissioned, the boundaries clearly marked, the restoration work she had undertaken in good faith, and the sudden appearance of the fence that sliced through her property like a wound. She laid each document before the council members in turn, letting them examine the notary seals, the county signatures, the crisp lines of the modern survey map. She could see their heads nod, could hear the scratch of pens taking notes, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that clarity was within reach. But then Alan Harrison rose, unfolded his yellowed map with a reverence that bordered on religious, and spread it across the table so that its creases lay flat beneath the harsh lights. The paper looked fragile, as though it might crumble with age, but the inked boundary line, recently traced over in darker pen, was bold and unmistakable. He spoke with calm authority, recounting the supposed transfer of land that had been forgotten by bureaucrats, explaining how his family had lived under the shadow of this error for decades, and declaring that only now, through his diligence, had the truth been restored. Then Ruth opened her binder and produced a notarized copy of what she called a boundary adjustment agreement from the 1970s, bearing signatures and an embossed seal that looked disturbingly genuine. The council members leaned in, whispering among themselves, their brows furrowed with uncertainty. One of them asked Laura whether she could directly refute the authenticity of the Harrisons' documents, and in that instant she felt the solid ground beneath her slip. She had proof of her ownership. Yes, but what if their papers were not crude forgeries but clever manipulations of older records, fragments drawn from the town's disorganized archives and stitched together into something that could pass official scrutiny? She felt a wave of dizziness as she realized that truth alone might not be enough. Truth required recognition, and recognition could be swayed by the mere presence of ink and signatures. Determined not to crumble, she reached into her folder and pulled out the discovery she had guarded most carefully. A bundle of letters written in the 1930s between the then owners of her house and the Harrison family's predecessors. The correspondence revealed heated disputes over the very strip of land now in question, culminating in a lawsuit that had been dismissed when the Harrisons' ancestor failed to pay court fees. The transfer they now claimed had been completed had, in fact, never been executed, and the court records showed the case closed without resolution in their favor. She laid the letters before the council, her hand steady though her pulse thundered in her ears, and explained how these documents contradicted the Harrisons' narrative. The council chamber grew tense with silence as the members examined the fragile pages. Finally, one cleared his throat and acknowledged that the existence of conflicting historical records made it impossible to accept the Harrisons' claim at face value. He suggested the matter would need further review by a legal authority, perhaps even the courts, before any enforcement could occur. Laura felt a flicker of relief, not triumph, but the sense of having gained a reprieve, a breath in the midst of suffocation. Yet the Harrisons did not falter. Ruth smiled faintly, almost pityingly, and leaned toward Laura across the table, speaking softly enough that the council could not hear, but with words sharp as broken glass. Paper fades, but memory remains. Everyone here knows this land has always been ours. You're clinging to something that doesn't belong to you, and sooner or later you'll see it. The quiet venom of her tone sent a shiver down Laura's spine more potent than any shouted threat. When the hearing concluded with no definitive ruling, Laura walked out into the pale afternoon light feeling both victorious and defeated. She had prevented the council from endorsing the Harrisons' claim, but she had not stopped them either. They could continue to build, to file complaints, to weave their narrative into the fabric of local gossip until repetition gave it the sheen of truth. As she crossed the parking lot, she noticed two of her neighbors standing together, whispering as they watched her pass, their eyes uncertain, perhaps sympathetic, perhaps skeptical. She realized then that the battle was no longer confined to documents and deeds. It had spilled into the subtle court of public opinion, into the sideways glances and hushed conversations that could isolate her long before any legal judgment was made. That night she sat at her desk, the bundle of letters spread before her, the photographs of her house across decades arranged like a timeline of endurance. She should have felt fortified, armed with history itself, yet instead she felt the hollow ache of someone standing at the midpoint of a war whose end could not be seen. The Harrisons had revealed not only their willingness to forge or distort the past, but also their relentless confidence, their ability to project certainty even in the face of contradiction. And Laura understood with a clarity that chilled her blood. This was not simply about property lines or an old house. It was about domination, about erasing her presence from a place she had claimed as her own, about breaking her resolve until she surrendered. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the peace she had once felt on this porch she had restored, plank by plank. But even in the silence, she could hear the echo of Ruth's words, soft and cruel. Everyone knows it was always ours. It was in that moment that Laura recognized she was no longer defending a house. She was defending the very right to exist in the space she had built for herself. And she knew the conflict was far from reaching its darkest turn. The weeks that followed the hearing hollowed Laura in ways she had not expected, for she had imagined that the most difficult part would be standing in the chamber and presenting her case under the scrutinizing eyes of the council. But in truth, the harder trial came afterward, in the silence of her home where the Harrisons' presence pressed against her walls like an invisible weight. Each day she returned from work to find their fence extending farther, its skeleton rising higher, wooden panels filling the gaps until her yard seemed divided by a barrier that was both physical and psychological. She had protested, had called the police again, had even written a desperate letter to the county clerk demanding intervention. But each reply came back the same. This was a civil dispute, to be resolved in court, and until judgment was issued there was little anyone could do. Thus, the Harrisons worked without pause, moving deliberately, their hammers echoing in the evenings like a grim metronome marking time. And though Laura raged inwardly, she could do nothing but watch as her property was transformed into a battleground. It was not only the fence. One evening she arrived home to find her front porch strangely altered, the chairs she had arranged neatly pushed aside, chalk markings running along the boards as though someone had drawn an imaginary border through the space where she drank her morning coffee. On the siding of her house a faint pencil line had been traced, accompanied by the words, "Boundary begins here," written in a hand that was unmistakably Ruth's. The intrusion was subtle yet devastating, for it carried not only the insult of trespass but the insidious suggestion that her ownership was slipping away, that the very walls she had restored were no longer considered hers even by those who lived beside her. The campaign extended beyond her property. Rumors began to drift through the neighborhood, carried in whispers that reached Laura's ears when she least expected. At the grocery store, she overheard two women murmuring that the Bennett house was built partly on stolen land, that Laura had known but ignored it, that she was trying to cheat the Harrisons out of what rightfully belonged to them. At the post office, a clerk handed her mail with a look of awkward pity, as though sympathizing with someone caught in scandal. These small shifts in atmosphere cut deeply, for Laura realized the Harrisons had begun to wage war not only through maps and posts, but through the shaping of perception, eroding her reputation with the same persistence with which they hammered nails into wood. The stress manifested physically. She woke each night in the small hours with her heart racing, her sheets damp with sweat, the image of fence posts looming in her mind. She walked through her house checking locks, sometimes standing at the window for long minutes watching the dark outline of the Harrisons' yard, half expecting to see Ruth standing there with her quiet, satisfied smile. She ate little, worked mechanically at her office, and felt her body tighten with exhaustion. Yet within this weariness grew a sharper determination, a refusal to surrender even as the ground seemed to tilt beneath her. Her turning point came when she returned one Friday evening and discovered the Harrisons' workers tearing at the corner of her veranda, prying boards loose under the pretext that they extended into the disputed zone. The sight nearly broke her. She stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe that her sanctuary was being dismantled before her eyes. But then something inside her hardened. She strode forward, demanded they stop, and when Alan emerged from his yard to argue that they were simply reclaiming their side, she shouted with a clarity that startled even herself. "Touch one more board, and I will have you in court so fast your lies will burn to ash." Her voice carried across the street, drawing curtains aside in neighboring houses, and though Alan sneered, the workers hesitated and withdrew. It was a small victory, but in that instant Laura understood she could no longer play the passive victim. That night she sat at her desk and gathered every document, every photograph, every letter she had collected, arranging them into a coherent narrative of defense. She contacted an attorney recommended by a colleague, a woman named Meredith Clark, who listened intently over the phone and agreed to take the case. For the first time since the ordeal began, Laura felt the faint pulse of strength return, the sense that she was not entirely alone against the tide. But she also knew that hiring a lawyer would not immediately stop the Harrisons, who thrived on escalation and seemed almost to draw energy from her resistance. Indeed, the following week she found a new letter taped to her door, this time not from the Harrisons but from the zoning board, informing her that a complaint had been filed accusing her of illegal renovation on historic property. The accusation was absurd. Every improvement she had made was cosmetic, within guidelines, but she recognized the tactic at once. The Harrisons were flooding every channel with attacks, forcing her to defend herself on multiple fronts, draining her time, her money, and her spirit. It was then she realized the conflict had evolved beyond a dispute about land. It was a siege of attrition, an attempt to wear her down until she abandoned her home altogether. And yet, as she walked through her house that night, touching the walls she had painted, the floors she had sanded, the windows she had polished until they gleamed, she whispered to herself that she would not give them the satisfaction. The house was more than wood and brick. It was the embodiment of her survival, the proof of her resilience. To surrender it would be to erase everything she had fought to reclaim. The Harrisons could build their fence, spread their rumors, file their complaints, but she would endure, and in enduring she would find a way to break them. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, the air heavy with the quiet anticipation of people who understood that what would be decided within these walls would ripple outward to reshape more than a line on a map. Laura sat beside her attorney Meredith Clark at the long oak table, her documents stacked neatly, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. Across the aisle, Alan and Ruth Harrison sat in rigid silence, their attorney a smooth-faced man who seemed almost amused by the proceedings, as if confident that possession of stamped papers would outweigh any human appeal. Laura felt the weight of months pressing down on her shoulders, every sleepless night and every moment of helpless rage condensed into this single morning. The judge entered, his robes sweeping the floor, and the trial began with the solemn rhythm of procedure. Meredith spoke first, presenting the deed, the survey, and the historical letters that revealed the Harrisons' predecessors had lost their claim nearly a century ago. She spoke with clarity and precision, weaving the evidence into a story of continuity, of rightful ownership maintained without interruption until Laura had purchased the home and restored it with her own hands. Laura watched the judge's expression carefully, noting the small nods, the way his eyes lingered over the signatures and seals that carried the authority of law rather than rumor. For the first time in months, she felt the fragile thread of hope tighten into something more tangible. Then the Harrisons' attorney rose and spread the yellowed map across the table with theatrical care. He spoke of oversight, of records lost to bureaucratic neglect, of families cheated out of land that was theirs by heritage. He produced the notarized copy of the supposed boundary adjustment, passing it to the judge with a flourish, and argued that Laura's home had stood partly on Harrison property for decades, the injustice hidden only by clerical incompetence. His words carried the cadence of righteousness, and as Laura listened she felt the familiar chill return, the fear that even falsehood spoken with conviction could take root in receptive soil. But Meredith had anticipated this. She requested forensic examination of the Harrison document, and the results, delivered that very morning, revealed the cruel simplicity of the deception. The paper was indeed old, taken from genuine town records, but the embossed seal had been pressed with a modern die, a forgery layered upon authenticity like a parasite feeding on a host. She laid the report before the judge, her voice unwavering as she explained how desperation had driven the Harrisons to create an illusion of legitimacy, how they had twisted fragments of truth into a weapon against their neighbor. The judge's face hardened as he read, his pen tapping lightly against the desk. Silence stretched across the chamber, broken only by the faint shuffle of papers. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured yet resonant. The evidence presented by the Harrisons was not credible. The boundary line established by Laura's deed and survey was legally binding, and the continued construction of the fence constituted unlawful encroachment. He ordered the immediate removal of the barrier and instructed that damages be assessed for the destruction already caused to Laura's property. The words seemed to echo, reverberating through the walls, and Laura felt her breath catch as if she had been underwater for months and at last broken the surface. Alan Harrison's face tightened, his jaw clenched as though he were biting back words he knew would bring him contempt. Ruth, however, could not restrain herself. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and trembling with fury, declaring that no judge could erase memory, that everyone knew the land was theirs, that Laura would never be welcome even if she won her papers and her verdicts. Her outburst drew a warning from the judge, who rapped his gavel sharply, but the damage was done. In her anger, she had revealed the heart of their campaign, the pursuit of truth but a desire to drive Laura out by force of intimidation. As the session adjourned, Laura remained seated for a moment, her hands trembling now not with fear, but with the overwhelming release of tension. She had stood at the brink of losing everything, and against the machinery of lies she had held her ground. She gathered her papers slowly, deliberately, as though anchoring herself in the solidity of the victory. When she finally rose, she glanced across the aisle at Ruth, whose smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold hatred, and she understood that the legal battle might be over, but the human enmity would linger like smoke long after a fire was extinguished. Yet for the first time she did not feel crushed beneath that hostility. She felt larger than it, steadier, as though her house itself had lent her its strength. The fence came down slowly, not with the suddenness of collapse but with the reluctant surrender of something that had tried to root itself where it did not belong. Workers arrived under court order, dismantling each panel and stacking the wood neatly at the curb as though tidying away the remnants of a quarrel that had poisoned the street. Laura stood at her window and watched without satisfaction, feeling instead a quiet exhaustion, the kind that follows a long illness rather than a victory. Her house, scarred where boards had been pried loose and earth churned by posts, stood whole again, yet the memory of intrusion clung to it like a shadow. Neighbors passed and glanced toward her yard, some offering tentative smiles, others avoiding her gaze, as if uncertain whether she had won or merely survived. Inside, she moved through her rooms with a new awareness, her hand brushing against the walls she had once feared losing, each step a reminder of the fragility of ownership and the strength required to defend it. She found herself lingering on the porch in the evenings, not in celebration but in contemplation, staring at the open space where the fence had cut across her life, now bare and quiet, the grass slowly reclaiming its place. She thought often of Ruth's words in court, the venom that no ruling could erase, and she understood that some conflicts never end with documents or judgments but remain etched in glances, in silence, in the way people carry themselves past one. Another on a narrow sidewalk, yet she no longer trembled at that thought. She had stood through the storm and the house still held, and in its endurance she found her own. On the first warm night of summer she placed a chair at the very edge of the porch, in the spot where chalk lines had once tried to divide her world, and sat with a book open on her lap, though she hardly read a word. The air was gentle, the crickets steady, and for the first time in months she felt a stillness that was not fragile but firm. She whispered to herself that the house was hers, not because papers said so, not because a judge had ruled, but because she had fought for it and would continue to guard it. It was a place rebuilt not only with wood and paint but with the refusal to be erased. And as she sat in that silence she realized that home was not the end of the battle, but the reason to endure it, a truth that could never be taken from her again.